for financial services right now. But we're going to get started with our guests, Mr. Ron Fine from Free Speech for People, and Dr. Alan Lichtman, who is a professor at American University. So I'm going to start by giving some brief biography for Dr. Lichtman and also Mr. Fine. So Mr. Fine graduated from Stanford Law School. He's the legal director for Free Speech for People, which has a project right now called Impeach Donald Trump Now. And you can see the link for that on the back of your handout. Mr. Fine clerked for Douglas, the United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts. He also clerked for the Honorable Kermit Lopez of the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. He previously served as the Assistant Regional Counsel in the United States Environmental Protection Agency's New England office, and he's the co-author of the book, The Constitution Demands It, The Case for Impeachment of Donald Trump. So please welcome Mr. Fine. Okay, to Dr. Lichtman. So Dr. Lichtman, American political historian who teaches at American University in Washington, D.C. He's from Brooklyn, New York, and he received his PhD from Harvard University. He's well known for predicting most of the presidential winners in the United States presidential election since 1984. He's authored the book, The Case for Impeachment, in April 2017, laying out multiple arguments for the impeachment of Donald Trump. He's also consulted for Vice President Al Gore and State Senator Edward Kennedy. So if you could just welcome Dr. Lichtman. Okay, so why don't we start, Dr. Lichtman, with just a historical background of impeachment in the United States.
Like the Sundance Kid, I have to move or I can't talk. But being a professor, I'm starting you out with a pop quiz. You ready? It's an easy one. How many of you think we ought to start impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump tomorrow? 49% of the American people agree with you. In the latest CNN poll, that's more than at any time in polling thought that President Richard Nixon ought to be impeached. Now, I know you think impeachment is this very austere, intellectual, legal, political process, but the truth is, you know who controls impeachment? You do, the American people. Impeachment will occur only if the American people actually demand it. Now, I'm going to do something you'll never hear again in the talk on impeachment. I'm going to start out by quoting Donald Trump, of all people. Remember what Donald Trump said? Don't believe see or hear. Well, I will tell you, much better. Don't believe what you see and hear about impeachment, especially from Donald Trump or his minions, Rudy Giuliani or Alan Dershowitz. Alan Dershowitz used to be, a pretty righteous guy. Now he's become a clone of Donald Trump. And you know why? I'll tell you why. Because he suddenly realized in his 80s this was a way to become famous. The liberal who supports Donald Trump. It's all an act. I'll tell you that. It is amazing, though, that Donald Trump's apologists should be even using the I word, right? That tells you how far we've come since I first published my book, as was indicated, almost a year and a half ago, and virtually everything I talked about in that book, the Russian connection, the war on women, the lies, the flouting of the law, the war on the environment, is coming to pass. But on impeachment, as I said, don't believe a word you hear from the Dershowitzes and the Giulianis of this world, because they're spewing myths and they're spewing lies. And I'm going to talk about the real story of impeachment, based on our Constitution and based on our framers. First myth that is being perpetrated about impeachment is that impeachment requires an indictable crime. False. Constitution says the House of Representatives has the sole authority to impeach a president, and the Senate, by 2/3 vote, has the sole authority to remove a president. And the standards for impeachment are very broad: bribery, treason, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And of course, the framers never defined what is meant by high crimes and misdemeanors, did they? Gerald Ford, way back when he was minority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, said, you know what the standard for impeachment is? It's whatever the U.S. House of Representatives decides it is at any given moment. And there's a lot of truth to that, because impeachment is the sole prerogative of the U.S. House. The courts play absolutely no role. But Ford's definition may be a little bit too broad, and we can narrow it down a bit. High crimes and misdemeanors. Why add misdemeanors? Misdemeanor is a crime, supposedly. So if you're already including high crimes, why add the word misdemeanor? And there's a simple answer, and it's provided by the framers of the Constitution, because they mean impeachment to be not just an indictable crime, but serious misconduct on the part, particularly of the president, giving the enormous powers that the framers put in the presidency of the United States. They did not mean impeachment to be strictly a legal, formal process. Otherwise, they would have put it in the judiciary, not in an elected body like the U.S. House and ultimately the U.S. Senate. They full well understood that impeachment was a combined legal, moral, and political judgment to be made by the people's representatives. Alexander Hamilton, the greatest expositor of the U.S. Constitution, made it crystal clear in a quote that headlines my book when he said, "Impeachment will follow from the misconduct of public men and relates chiefly to injuries done to the society as a whole." Not indictable crimes necessarily, although they could fall under that, but injuries done to the society. And as you know, the laws on the statute books are constantly changing. Back in Alexander Hamilton's time, and in fact even through the 1970s, we didn't really have campaign finance laws. So violations that we have today of the campaign finance laws didn't exist until the 1970s. And so many other laws appear and disappear from the statute books. Go back historically. The first impeachment in U.S. history, which was a successful one, was the impeachment of federal court Judge Pickering. And Judge Pickering was not charged with a crime. He was charged with an inability to carry out the functions of his office because he was suffering from severe mental illness. Who was the first president to be impeached? Andrew Johnson in 1868. He was not impeached for an indictable crime. He was impeached for violating a civil statute, the Tenure of Office Act, restricting his ability to fire and hire members of his cabinet, and he was impeached for using intemperate language that called Congress into disrepute. Bill Clinton was impeached for indictable crimes, perjury and obstruction of justice, but arguably those were not high crimes because they involved a personal, consensual affair, not the conduct of state. And Richard Nixon, who resigned before the full House could vote on articles of impeachment voted by the House Judiciary Committee had one of those articles of impeachment abuse of power. Not necessarily an indictable crime, but even more serious, abusing the power of the presidency for political and partisan purposes. Second myth of impeachment is that impeachment is this catastrophic event. You hear Rudy Giuliani talking about riots and violence, Roger Stone talking about violence in the streets if we have impeachment. In fact, the framers put impeachment into the Constitution advisedly as an alternative to the way in which rogue rulers were dealt with in their time, which was by assassination or revolution. Instead of that, they put impeachment into the Constitution as a legal, peaceful, and orderly means of dealing with a rogue president, especially a president. There was no tragedy when Andrew Johnson was impeached. In fact, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson was good for the country because Andrew Johnson was obstructing the integration of the newly freed slaves into American life, and he moderated that opposition after being chastised by impeachment. Did terrible things follow the impeachment of Richard Nixon, or the near impeachment, his resignation? Hardly. We removed a president who was a danger to our democracy. Critics cried, if we impeach Bill Clinton, we'll weaken and destroy the presidency. In fact, the presidency emerged stronger than ever after the impeachment of Bill Clinton. So impeachment is not some extraordinary catastrophic event. It is a peaceful means, an orderly means, a constitutional means of dealing with a runaway president. And you know what the framers were most concerned about when it came to the president? Corruption by foreign powers. Alexander Hamilton said, foreign influence is the Trojan horse of a democracy. James Madison said, if our chief magistrate should become corrupted by foreign influences, that would prove fatal to our republic. Third myth is that impeachment cannot be for transgressions that take place before the assumption of the presidency. In other words, that Donald Trump could be exonerated even if he conspired with the Russians to rig an election because he wasn't yet the president of the United States. Another myth. There is nothing in the Constitution that places a time limit on impeachment. And surely a transgression committed to get yourself elected president and undermine our democracy would absolutely qualify as a high crime, even if it occurred before the assumption of the presidency. And in fact, there is precedent for this. A few years ago, a judge by the name of Judge Porteous was impeached, at least in part for corrupt acts that occurred prior to his assuming the bench. And one of the senators who voted for his impeachment said, absolutely, events that occur, if they are corrupt before taking office, can be part of the impeachment process. You know who that senator was? Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, now Attorney General of the United States. He might not be singing the same song today, but we know it was a righteous song back when he sung it as a senator. So, what are the lessons, my friend? Impeachment is the appropriate remedy for a runaway, rogue president who endangers our national security, our liberties, our freedom, our great traditions like an independent judiciary, a free press, tolerance among different groups in the country. And don't get hung up on whether it is a technically indictable crime under the statute law. Secondly, impeachment is the appropriate process for dealing with a dangerous president. The framers understood that. It's not a catastrophic event. It is an orderly, peaceful, and legal means for protecting ourselves from a dangerous chief executive. And if it relates to the election of a president, or conduct in office, like policy towards the Russians, then this legal, political, moral process cannot be limited to those acts that occur only after the assumption of the presidency. You know, there's an old Chinese saying, some say it's a curse, but it certainly applies very well today, as Mr. Fine will pick up, and that is, my friends, may you live in interesting times. Thank you so much.
I'll sit. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? In the back too? Can you hear me all right? Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Ross and Professor Lichtman, and of course to Congressman Green, and to all of you, because I know there are a lot of great options at this conference, and for you to come here, I really appreciate that. My name is Ron Fine. I'm with Free Speech for People. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We were established in 2010 to fight against the influence of money in politics after the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision. And when Donald Trump was elected president and said he would not give up his businesses even while he was in the Oval Office, we said to ourselves, what could be more unholy mixture of money and politics than the president running his businesses out of the Oval Office? We also have a book. It's called The Constitution Demands It. It's a great companion to Professor Lichtman's book, and I hope you have an opportunity to buy both. First thing I want to say is I agree with everything he just said. Everything.
That really happened.
And in fact, it enables me to skip some of the things I was going to cover. But what's important to know about that is that virtually everyone who has actually studied this and is being serious about it would also agree with everything that he just said. So, for example, the issue of whether impeachable offenses have to be crimes for which you can be prosecuted. There's no dispute about this among people who have actually studied the history of the Constitution, things that the framers said during the constitutional debates, during the debates about ratifying the Constitution, things Supreme Court justices have said, things that Congress itself has said in its official documents about the relationship between impeachment and crimes. If you have 1,000 people who would come up here and talk about that, who have actually looked into this, 998 of them are going to agree with everything that Professor Lichtman just said. The other two are going to be on Fox News. But it's also important to note that some of the leadership of the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party has been repeating some of these myths. For example, that we need to wait for Special Counsel Mueller to complete his investigation before we can even think about impeachment. And that's wrong for several reasons. One is, of course, not all impeachable offenses are crimes in the first place. Special Counsel Mueller has a very limited mandate. He's only looking at the 2016 election and things that came up out of that, not all the other things that have been going on in the presidency. Third, he's looking at proving criminal cases in court, and that includes a lot of technical legal requirements that are involved in trying to get 12 jurors to agree beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump is guilty of certain federal crimes. And that means that there are issues that will go unaddressed by Mueller. So one of the things that we wanted to do with our book is to answer the question of what are the grounds for impeachment based on what the president has done, that Congress could start impeachment hearings not even tomorrow, today. And we identified 8 grounds in the book, came out in August, and since then we've had to add 2 more. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a very quick survey of those 10 grounds, and then I'm going to focus in particular on one that Representative Green asked me to focus on, which is the relationship between bigotry and impeachment. So the 10 grounds are, the first one is accepting unconstitutional emoluments or payments from foreign governments. This is something Trump does through his businesses, and he was advised between the election and the inauguration that he needed to separate himself from ownership of his businesses or else this would be a problem. And he chose to ignore that advice. And so he was actually violating the Constitution from the moment he took the oath of office. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's a technicality. That's something a lot of people never even heard the word emoluments until this came up. But I think you'll agree as you hear the rest of the list that the fact that Congress did nothing in response to the emoluments taught Trump a lesson, that he could violate the Constitution with impunity, and he could get away with more and more, and that's what we saw. So the second ground we identified is something that does overlap with the Mueller investigation, and that's soliciting foreign help during the 2016 election, which is illegal under campaign finance law. And it's something that we don't have 100% of the facts in. That's what Congress can conduct hearings for. Congress also has investigative powers, doesn't have to put everything in Special Counsel Mueller's basket. And furthermore, we know that Trump was involved in the cover-up because he drafted the misleading statement on behalf of his son. The third ground that we identified is obstruction of justice. And again, Mueller is looking into this, but Mueller is looking at specific criminal statutes that have some technical requirements. And I'll just give you one example. One of the obstruction of justice statutes turns on whether the defendant attempted to obstruct a proceeding. And the term proceeding is in the statute. And there have been different courts have attempted to figure out what counts as a proceeding, what doesn't count. Now for Mueller, this is hugely important because if he's going to indict the president for obstructing a proceeding, he has to make sure that it's not going to get overturned on appeal based on what a proceeding is. Congress doesn't have to get involved in that kind of stuff. It's obvious that Trump has been attempting to frustrate or block the investigations into himself and his associates. Fourth ground, something that Richard Nixon did, is directing law enforcement to persecute his political adversaries and his critics. So Trump keeps an enemies list, just like Nixon did. In Trump's case, it's fairly public, and most of what he does is on Twitter, where he's urging Sessions to go after, why isn't the Department of Justice prosecuting this one, this one, this one, this one? And he's attempting to use the power of government to go after his enemies. In some cases it's happened, in some cases it hasn't because he's been blocked, but in all cases he's abusing the power of his office. Our fifth ground is abusing the pardon power. This is something James Madison himself said would be a ground for impeachment. And Trump violated this with his very first pardon, which is the pardon of Joe Arpaio, the sheriff from Arizona. Now, obviously, when presidents issue pardons, a lot of them are controversial. And so that's not to say that just any controversial pardon is ground for impeachment. But the pardon of Joe Arpaio crossed the line that no other pardon by any president had ever crossed. And I'll tell you what that line is. Arpaio was convicted of criminal contempt of court for deliberately violating a court order to stop violating the constitutional rights of Latino drivers. And Trump pardoned him for that criminal contempt of court. It wasn't a case of Arpaio showing remorse for his actions. In fact, Trump praised him for what he did. Now, if you want to understand why this is so bad, actually one great example would be if you think of the massive resistance that happened in the 50s and 60s to the desegregation orders coming out of courts. One of the major weapons that the Justice Department had in those days was court orders. And they could threaten criminal contempt of court against segregationist governors or other local officials who would ignore those court orders. But if the president just can get out of jail free card to those court orders, that means individuals' constitutional rights depend on the whim of the president. The sixth ground, and this is one I'm going to talk about in detail, so I'll just mention it here, is advocating illegal violence and undermining the equal protection of the laws. And I'll come back to that in much more detail. Our seventh ground is reckless endangerment by threatening nuclear war. And this is something that he does on Twitter. Now, this is not a case of a president who's doing some kind of multi-dimensional chess where he's thinking about all the different layers of how he might use diplomacy along with strategic threats. This is someone who even his own advisors admit doesn't really know what he's doing. He's just making a tweet against North Korea, and God help us all if they misinterpret his tweet as an announcement of a launch. He's been undermining the freedom of the press, not by direct censorship, but as some authoritarian leaders in other countries have discovered, you can undermine a free press even without direct censorship. The ninth ground, and we just briefly mentioned in our book because it was going to press as it was happening, is the shameful treatment of the children and families migrating across the border from Mexico. Cruel and unusual punishment. In the case of the children, they had committed no crime. In the case of the adults, some of them had committed no crime, or in some cases a very minor crime, an immigration offense that did not justify that horrific treatment. And finally, this is something that we mention in the book as a potential new ground that we didn't yet have the evidence for. We now have the evidence for it, which is the illegal hush money payments that were made in the 2016 election. Michael Cohen, just recently, the president's personal lawyer, pled guilty to federal crimes and said that Trump directed him to make those illegal payments. So these are the grounds for impeachable offenses, for impeachment hearings. I want to zoom in now on one in particular, which is the relationship of Trump's bigotry and his policies and how those play into impeachment. What I need to say at the outset is that not every illegal action or not even every unconstitutional action is an impeachable offense. And of course, not every impeachable offense is illegal or unconstitutional. It includes abuses of power. I want to quote somebody for a moment who is no one's idea of a left-winger, who's not a liberal or a Democrat. This is a scholar named Robert Nadelson who writes for the Federalist Society, which is a conservative legal organization. And this is what he says about the standard of high crimes and misdemeanors in the Constitution. He says, "We best capture the meaning of the phrase high misdemeanors when we think of it as referring to breaches of fiduciary duty. High misdemeanors are not limited to commission of crimes. While violations of the criminal law provide grounds for impeachment, high misdemeanors encompass breaches of the duties of loyalty, good faith, and care, and of the obligations to account and to follow instructions, including the law and Constitution, when administering one's office." So let me break that down into something practical. The President of the United States has fiduciary duties to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Here are some of those laws. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, passed during Reconstruction right after the Civil War, requires equal protection of the laws, prohibits the government from denying to any person within the United States the equal protection of the laws. The federal government has an obligation in the Constitution to protect the public from domestic violence. And finally, something that's not written in the Constitution, but I think is sort of implicit, is that we don't adopt the ideologies of our defeated enemies posthumously. And if you think of some of the struggles and the wars even that have most defined our nation, I would say among the top two would be the Civil War and World War II. And both of these were fights against different forms of racial supremacy. The Civil War obviously fighting against the slave powers of the South, and World War II fighting against Nazism and also the Japanese imperial ideology. You know, we fought and we defeated the Confederate slave power and the Nazis, and we can certainly make peace with former enemies and turn them into allies, but we don't then adopt their ideologies as part of American principles. So where do we draw the line? Where do we say, because we don't want to be among those people who will say anything is grounds for impeachment, because that's not true. Where do we draw a line and say, you know, these grounds are things we might vote against him for or whatever, but they're not grounds for impeachment, and above this line they are grounds for impeachment. So I want to start off by things that might not be impeachable offenses that reflect bigotry, just so we have a baseline. First of all, you can't impeach the man for thoughts that he has in his head if he doesn't do anything about them. So we're not going to impeach a president for having racist opinions or beliefs that he doesn't act on, or maybe that he just talks about privately but doesn't act on. If that was the standard, we probably would have had to impeach a lot of our past presidents. Another thing we might say is that if there are policies or actions that are within the presidential powers, comply with all laws, comply with the Constitution, but they have a disparate racial impact, that may not be a ground for impeachment. You know, again, it may be struck down by a court, but it may not be a ground for removing the president. And finally, just say that it's not automatically the case that anything that violates a law or the Constitution is a ground for impeaching and removing the president, because again, every president has something that they do found illegal or unconstitutional by a court. It's the reality of being president. They're not all grounds for impeachment. So what racist acts do rise to that level? And I want to sketch out some criteria that I think are a good way to think about this. This is not taken from the text of the Constitution, because there's nothing in there that talks directly about this, but I think that these principles will make sense to you when I say them. This is a non-exhaustive list. There could be others I haven't thought of, and it's just because Trump gets creative in how he abuses his office. And these will be patterns of behavior. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that we need more than one action to impeach a president. You could impeach a president based on one misdeed, but part of the impeachment question is he a danger, an ongoing danger to society? And so impeachment is more likely to occur if there's more than one incident of something. So these are the types of patterns. The first one, and this should be obvious, is that advocating illegal violence or any other illegal activity is totally outside the powers of the presidency. The President of the United States has no authority to advocate illegal activity. And one of his earliest examples, which was really a continuation of things he said on the campaign trail, was when he told a group of police officers to be rough with arrested suspects. And he said, don't put your hand over their head as they get into the squad car, bang them around a little bit. And actually some police chiefs actually had to distance themselves from their remarks, as some of them said, we're actually under consent decrees from court to stop, some police brutality practices, you can't be giving this advice to cops. So advocating that police be rough with arrested suspects is totally outside of the scope of what the president could do. Another thing he's done is on Twitter, he's actually advocated war crimes against Muslims. He tweeted this whole long rant based on what turns out to be a myth about how a general in the Philippines had committed some acts that would now be considered violations of the law of war crimes against Muslims. So that's a first category, is advocating illegal violence. A second category, I would say, is sowing discord within American society and encouraging bigotry and violence by giving aid and comfort to neo-Nazis and white supremacists. In other words, sort of encouraging violence by others. Now, we have enough racial discord in society already. Trump didn't invent it, obviously, but we look to the president to not add to it. Some of the examples of this, he's retweeted some things that were very anti-Muslim. Of course, we know his remarks after Charlottesville, where he talked about very fine people marching with the Nazis. And he's used his bully pulpit for racist tirades. And this is important because the things that he tweets about or speaks about, a lot of the time, they're not exercises of executive power, but it's taxpayer funded. It's taxpayer funded when he's doing it on the job. So for example, when he's attacking the NFL players, mostly black, who are protesting against police brutality, he's doing that on the job. We're paying him to do that, to sow that sort of racial discord. And the issue here is not whether Donald Trump has freedom of speech. Of course he does, like anyone else. But the Supreme Court itself has said that employees who are engaged in on-the-job speech, even if they work for the government, can be disciplined for expressions that they make as part of their professional duties. And the White House has confirmed that the president's Twitter account is official statements of the President of the United States. So in other words, we are literally paying him to and providing him with an amplified pulpit to go off on racist tirades. If he was a private citizen, he'd be doing this on his own dime, but now he's doing it on ours. The third category, I'll say, is enacting or promoting policies that have no constitutionally legitimate justification, but are rather motivated entirely by bigotry with either a thin pretext or no pretext at all. And some examples of this. One is the internment camps for Latino migrants. The second is restarting a practice. This is a practice that had existed before him, and then it was shut down, and then his administration has restarted, of challenging the citizenship of Latinos born in Texas, near the border with Mexico. Born in Texas, United States citizens, they're taking away their passports. Third, I already mentioned the pardon of Joe Arpaio. The Muslim ban. Right now, the Supreme Court pretended to believe that this was based on national security justifications, but Congress and the American people can look past that and say this was obviously a fulfillment of his campaign pledge to shut down Muslim immigration. He made a remark about, and I won't repeat it, but starts with the letter S and ends with ithol countries in reference to some African countries, Haiti and I think El Salvador, and talking about immigration policy in those terms. If he's going to take immigration policy based on those beliefs, that's another example. Important thing is that impeachment does not have an intent requirement, meaning Congress does not need to peer into the president's mind to try and figure out his real motivations. But the truth is, with Trump, that's not an issue because he telegraphs everything by either saying it on TV or on Twitter. So we know what he's intending and what he's doing. I want to bring up an interesting anecdote from the Nixon administration. Nixon, at one point, got worried about what Trump might call the deep state. He was worried about career economists in the Bureau of Labor Statistics who were putting out employment numbers that Nixon thought was unhelpful. This was in 1971, before Watergate, but we only found out about it years later, I think in 1976, with Woodward and Bernstein's first book. And Nixon decided that the reason that he was getting unfavorable employment numbers was that there were too many Jews in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So he asked a guy named Fred Malek, Nixon did, to find all the Jews in the Bureau of Labor Statistics and either demote them or transfer them out. And Malek went around doing that. He tried to figure out anyone who either was Jewish, he thought might be Jewish, and he either transferred them out or had them demoted. Where is Fred Malek today? Well, Trump recently appointed him to a position at a think tank affiliated with the Smithsonian Institution. Had we known about that in 1974, maybe that would have been part of the articles of impeachment against Nixon. The last thing I want to say about bigotry and impeachment is that, as Professor Lichtman mentioned, Andrew Johnson was the first president who was impeached. He escaped conviction by 1 vote in the Senate. The reason that he was impeached nominally on the face of it was for violating this somewhat obscure statute called the Tenure of Office Act. But the real reason that Congress impeached him, and everyone agrees with this as a historical matter, the real reason is that he was blocking Reconstruction. So every time Congress tried to pass a measure for Reconstruction, civil rights laws or other measures to help the newly freed slaves, Andrew Johnson would try and block it. And that was what motivated Congress to fight against him. Interestingly, after he was impeached and then had the trial and narrowly avoided conviction, for the remainder of his term, he stepped back. He stopped fighting Congress. He was chastened by that process, even though he had another 9 months in office. It worked for that purpose. So, final topic, why should we pursue impeachment on this basis? Why, and I'm particularly talking about this aspect of bigotry here. One is to stop ongoing harm. Okay, so stop the policies themselves. Now, of course, it's possible that Vice President Pence, upon becoming president, could continue some of those policies, but he might be chastened, just like Andrew Johnson was. Second is, there's something called the Trump effect. What sociologists have noticed is that when Trump gives a rally in a certain city, if you compare that city to the week before, the week after, or if you compare it to other cities on that same day, there are more racial incidents, more violent incidents in schools and communities in cities where Trump is giving a rally. And I think everybody here knows that if you went to a high school basketball game and there was one team that was predominantly white and one team that was predominantly people of color, and people of the one team started chanting Trump, 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 everybody knows what that means. And what's happening is that Trump is tearing open some racial wounds that had certainly not been healed, but we were starting to make some progress on, and he's ripping them apart. There's a professor named Keith Whittington who says that one purpose of impeachment is what he calls constitutional construction. And what he means by that is that through impeachment, Congress establishes our American values. So one simple example is that most of our understanding of when it's appropriate for a president to meddle in the Justice Department and when it isn't comes out of Nixon and Nixon's impeachment. And here, I think that by pursuing impeachment on this ground, we established that the norms against racism that previous presidents honored, at least nominally, they at least pretended not to have racist motivations for their actions, are of constitutional significance. And if we allow Trump to continue unchecked, that norm will drop away, and we'll face more and more openly racist leadership. Impeachment can help limit the damage whether or not it succeeds, and Andrew Johnson is proof positive of that. But ultimately, the point is for Congress to establish who we as a people are. Now, the President of the United States, by virtue of his office, has a claim to speaking on behalf not only of the government, but of the country. And right now, Trump is using that representation to establish racism and hatred as official tenets of the United States of America. But Congress also has a claim to represent the people. And it can act forcefully to say, no, the United States is not an ethno-state based on blood and soil. It's a country that strives to live up to its highest ideals. Certainly it often doesn't, often falls short, but the promise of equality for all citizens is the ideal to which the moral arc of our country bends. And Trump's efforts to undermine not just the actual progress on that arc, but the ideal itself of equality demand his removal. Thank you.
So I'd like to ask both Dr. Lichtman and Mr. Fine to just talk about kind of the history of the CBC and impeachment. CBC was actually one of the first groups that called for impeachment for Nixon during Watergate. So if you could just talk about that a little bit and just their position as the conscience of Congress. And for our audience, if you look inside your handout, there's a picture of Barbara Jordan, and it also has some information about the Black Caucus and impeachment.
well, I'm not going to call myself an expert on the history of the CBC, but Barbara Jordan and John Conyers were instrumental in the Nixon impeachment. They were among the earliest calling for impeachment, and in fact, the foreword to our book has some extended quotes from Barbara Jordan at a time when others in Congress were, let's wait, go slow. Maybe these are not serious enough. Barbara Jordan was really one of the first to recognize that Nixon was a threat to the entire system of constitutional democracy that we have. She's absolutely right, as history proved. And someone who might seem like a voice in the wilderness at first may turn out to be a prophet in the future.
Let me pick up on that and say, the Congressional Black Caucus really has been, in many ways, the conscience of America. It's a group that has experienced oppression, a group that has fought for their own rights and for the rights of every American, and above and beyond any other members of Congress, the members of the Congressional Black Caucus have been the champions of justice. And if you look at who has been in the forefront of raising our consciousness about Donald Trump, it has been members of the Black Caucus. Representative Al Green, Representative Maxine Waters, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, right? These are the champions. These have been the leaders, while others have stood on the sidelines, have been too timid, or rationalized away the transgressions of Donald Trump. History, as the civil rights movement proved, is not changed by bending to the conventional wisdom, by taking the safe path, by saying, political reality demands, that we step back. In fact, the CBC has proven, the civil rights movement has proven, we can create our own political reality. And that's the way change takes place. And the CBC really has been right now in the forefront of it. And I can't tell you how proud I am of some of these members.
We started some questions, and the congressman is just a few minutes away. He's done with votes. So I'm just going to come down and give you the mic.
Thank you. I apologize, gentlemen. I missed your introductory. I didn't get your names, but I don't know if you knew Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan was not for illegal immigration. And I'm not clear what the charges you are saying on Mr. Trump is, but I will say this much. I'm a well-old man now. I've lived throughout the black community, and I know justice has not been done for many of us. And I know a lot of the drugs, a lot of the guns has come to our community through certain agencies of the government. And if we want to get specific, let's talk about the FBI. My question is, why have you not impeached certain Democrats, which I'm a Democrat party? Why is it you're so in the rush to get rid of Trump when he just got in office, and we've had corruption all these years? In the FBI, he's gotten rid of 25 already. So, you want a question or a discussion? Okay. Well, my question is, do you think you're really fooling us?
We're not fooling anybody at all. It's the president who's fooling us. Just today, the newspaper, did you read it? 5,000 lies and misleading statements since the president has taken office, and it has accelerated. 5,000 lies and misleading statements since the president of the United States has taken office. Now look, you had your say,
Global corruption that you've been part of?
I've been part of, God, I wish I benefited from this corruption. What are you talking about?
Don't dominate the session.
That I'm part of? As a humble professor with no power?
collectively.
All right. Jeffrey Money, 4 times newspaper, National Newspaper Publishers Association. Thank you so much for everything you shared today. I have a question. You mentioned that the recent poll said 49% of Americans were in agreement with impeachment. You also said that we as citizens control whether impeachment proceedings begin and continue. So the question I have is, if the people actually have the power to begin that, and 49% say that we should move forward, why hasn't it happened yet?
It's a terrific question. Why, if 49% want impeachment, why hasn't it moved forward? And the simple reason is, break down that poll and what do you find? Overwhelmingly, it's Democrats and independents who are calling for impeachment, and Republicans who still stand behind the president. And who controls the Congress? Republicans. So only 2 things are possible. One, there's enough of a groundswell that Republicans come to believe that Donald Trump is going to take them down. One of the Lichtman rules of politics is, for office holders, their top priority, maybe their only priority, is political survival. And if they believe their political survival is jeopardized by Donald Trump, that's the only thing that would motivate them to act. And then, of course, the other way in which action can take place would be if the Democrats take over the Congress, which I think is a pretty fair shot in the November election. So if you believe that this president has crossed the line and we should begin impeachment inquiry, then vote, organize, contribute, sign petitions, get out there and act, because in the end, I still believe we have a democracy responsive to the people.
Republican won't, but not a democracy.
Hi, my name is Monica Cross. I'm sorry, sir, I have a mic. My name is Monica Cross Williams. I'm actually a trustee, which is pretty much like a city council person in my community. And we talked about fiduciary duty, and you brought that up. And that's something that I'm very concerned about, because as a trustee, one of the things that we are is fiduciary officers. And I look at the state of our country. I know right now the saying is that the economy is doing well. If you look at the numbers underneath, it's not really all that strong, because inflation is going up, and also the cost of living, as in wages, is being stagnated. So you talked about fiduciary responsibility, and I have a lot of questions if the person that's in the office of president right now is actually handling our country the way it should be, based on the fiduciary responsibilities of the office itself. What's your thoughts about that? And is that a cause for impeachment alone?
Yeah, so this is thank you for that question. This is a very tricky area, at which point, say, presidential sort of incompetence rises to the level of impeachment. During the debates about the impeachment provision in the Constitution, I happen to know the exact day. It's July 20th, 1787. Just because I've looked over this over and over again. The framers went back and forth on that standard, the standard of treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. And at one point, somebody proposed, what about maladministration? Should we include maladministration as a ground for impeachment? And they shot that down. They basically said, nah, that's too weak a standard. At that point, the Congress could impeach, president for anything at all. So they rejected that. And what that means is that a certain degree of sort of mishandling the country, mishandling the economy, not doing well, that's ultimately going to be for the voters to decide, not for impeachment. And so there are a lot of things that we didn't include in the book. And some people ask, for example, the botched recovery in Puerto Rico. Is that a ground for impeachment? And I'm not entirely sure, because it could be maladministration. And so I think the key thing with that breach of fiduciary duty is whether there's good faith. If he's actually trying to do the job, then you at that point in impeachment, it might not be a reason for impeachment if he's just sort of incompetent at it. But when he's maliciously abusing his powers without any attempt to do it in the national interest, even in a sort of a sense of the national interest that you or I might disagree with, if he at least thinks he's doing it in the national interest, maybe you cut him some slack. But what he's doing in so many of these areas is to either protect himself protect his supporters, distract from unfavorable news by creating some other scandal that will occupy the news cycle. Those are the kinds of things that are really the abuse of office, the abuse of public trust.
Let me say something real quick. I engage in a lot of these forums and debates.
Long before Donald Trump.
I'm next. Excuse me. I have raised my hand. Excuse me.
More and more about
You
the
dominate
Donald Trump.
We won't give you the mic.
I was going to say, I engage in a lot of these debates.
Is it for the white establishment? Because we need to deal with racism, and we are under a very racist system of government, period, that started long before Donald Trump.
Can we please let the next person ask their question? Thank you. Ma'am.
The doctor was answering my question. I would like to.
Racism. When are you black people gonna wake up? When are you people of color gonna wake up and see and stop?
Dr. Dershowitz, could you finish your question? Finish answering the question. I was the next person to ask a question, and I think we should have decorum and order in the room. I think it'd be fair for those who are signed to speak or next in line to be given the mic. I'm next in line. I'd like to have my opportunity. And first, I'd like you to answer your question.
Yeah. You know, as I said, this will be real fast. I participate in lots of these forums, lots of these debates, actually debated Alan Dershowitz on NPR, and just like we've heard here, I get the what about defense. Forget about Donald Trump, but what about Hillary Clinton? What about some other person? And I have an answer to that. And my answer is, guess what? I'm happy to trade with you. I'm happy to impeach Hillary Clinton if you agree to impeach Donald Trump.
Send her to jail first. Good afternoon. My name is Judson Robinson. I'm president and CEO of the Houston Area Urban League. I want to thank you all for attending. And I really want to thank you for bringing to us truth and facts. And I really wanted to kind of hear your opinion about truth and facts in today's modern debate. How do we get back to listening to what has been researched, what has been proven as true, when we've got, did you say 47,000 lies? So
5,000 he's hit, according to the Washington Post.
So how do we help people like some of the folks that may be in the room who are not listening to what has been determined to be the truth? Because we as a society have to be back on the same page, or at least back prior to the page we were on when Donald Trump took president.
The most astounding lie we got today from the president was, no, 3,000 people didn't die in Puerto Rico after the hurricanes. Only 15 or 20 people died, and the rest was all made up to make me look bad. Can you imagine that? Disregarding people's deaths and interpreting only in terms of him. I have a whole chapter about lies in my book, The Case for Impeachment. I have to tell you, as a professor, I've been teaching students for decades to respect facts, to try to come as close to the truth as we can, to try to use proven, established methods of analysis. And I see all of that being trashed by the White House. And occasionally they admit it. Remember, we present alternative facts, right? There aren't alternative facts. This is Orwellian. We really have gotten into a 1984 unreality where war is peace, famine is plenty, hate is love, and truth is whatever serves Big Brother, the leader, at the moment. This could be maybe the greatest casualty of the Trump era, because if you lose truth, you lose everything.
Stop letting these white supremacist people and white women
Excuse me. I have a question about the Trump effect.
Yes, please, we have another question.
I'm doing research on 12 steps, and how people can have an addiction, even a thinking addiction, and relapse if they stop practicing new thoughts. And what you said, let me see if I can repeat what you said. The Trump effect is that after Trump has a speech in somewhere, the racial incidents increase, which means more than before or after he got there. And it seems like you said if he continues, that could sort of like wear down people's anti-racism attitude, and more of them, and this begins to become a national problem, more so than it is now. Racism, I'm talking about.
Yes, thank you.
If he continues that.
Yes, and if you'll indulge me from reading a couple things, because I have the notes right here in the book, and I want to say, obviously, coming into a room at the CBC, that I obviously have not had the personal experience of racism that many or most of you may have experienced, but that the facts are in the numbers. And so first one is a survey of more than 10,000 educators, kindergarten through 12, found that the 2016 presidential election led to increases in verbal harassment, use of slurs and derogatory language, and disturbing incidents involving swastikas, Nazi salutes, and Confederate flags. Over 2,500 of those educators described specific incidents of bigotry and harassment that had occurred in their schools that can be traced to election rhetoric. A peer-reviewed epidemiological study of the 2016 election found that cities experienced a 12% increase in assaults on days when Trump held a rally as compared to days when there was no rally. The Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University found a sharp increase in the number of hate crimes in most of the nation's largest cities. There was a 91% increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes in the first half of 2017 as compared to the first half of 2016. And of course, the example of the sports events with schools or parking lots, when you hear Trump, 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 you know what that means. And again, I'm not suggesting that Trump invented racism. Obviously, this country has a long history. But what he's done is torn open a cover that had been put on some of the worst aspects of it. That will not be easy to put back together.
And don't forget, how did Trump make his political career? Do you remember? By claiming that the first African-American president was illegitimate, that he wasn't born in the United States, and he pushed that for years. So we knew who he was, well in advance of him becoming president.
We got a next question.
So first I'm gonna...
That Barack Obama was born in Hawaii has been proven 10 times over.
Excuse me. Just real quick, excuse me for a second. Sir, excuse me. First I want to qualify myself. My name is Gene Folks. I worked with Donald Trump, 2010 apprentice. I started talking about him back in 2010 when we knew we were in a contract with NBC for 5 years. Sir, excuse me for a second. So I want to qualify myself first. So I wrote a piece with the Associated Press called The Impotent Billionaire, and we're working on a piece right now with Donald Trump. I do have a question. I want to qualify that because a lot of times we're talking to a person that we don't know. And so I can feel some kind of way about him. There's been some attacks over the last 8 years, whether I've done AP, ITV, Good Morning Britain, I've done CNN, I've done Wall Street Journal. And one of the things that if you ask Ron Berkeley, the Associated Press, I'm actually the reason why Billy Bush got fired. Not on my road, he started talking first, I did. And so I ended up fighting NBC. And the thing that we got to understand about impeachment, at least my question, is that while we do have a lot of issues with this country, I believe that when you look at John Adams and the Founding Fathers, and when Franklin and those guys were writing sort of undercover, right, when they were trying to talk about impeachment, it's very an emotional topic. The question is, so if anybody should feel any kind of way about Donald Trump, should be me, to be real honest with you, right? He's a very sensitive human being. The question is, though, when we start talking about impeachment, there's two types. One where he remains seated, and the other where he's impeachment, we get him out of office. But in order for him to be impeached, it has to be a crime against the Union. And so can we actually have the evidence, whether Republican or Democrat, should cross both aisles, in the face from a judicial standpoint, in the face that he actually has
The congressman is
Okay.
here.
How you
so-
doing?
Good, how you doing?
Okay, hello everybody, how you doing? Thank you very much. I'm going to address your question myself in just a moment. But first, I think that we should give some expression of appreciation to our scholars. These are persons that I've worked with. They've been very helpful. I would invite you to read their works, and I think you will find them quite entertaining as well as informative. In fact, I think that they give pretty good explanations of why we need to move forward. So would you give both of them a big expression? Thank you very much. I'm going to say something about them in just a moment more, but I also think that my chief of staff, who is an NYU lawyer, who has done an outstanding job in helping me with all of these materials, I just believe that this is one of the times when I should say to you, if not but for her assistance, I wouldn't be able to produce the work product that we have produced. Would you give Amina Ross a big hand, please? I can see a city council person here from Houston, Texas, Jeff Boney. Jeff, stand up. Give him a hand, please. Former city council person, now the president of Houston Area Urban League, Justin Robinson. Would you stand up, please? A great American who is with CWA, the Communication Workers of America. He is quite involved in politics and has made a difference in the lives of a lot of people. Claude Cummings, give him a hand, please. Former president of the Houston Realtors Association, probably the second African American to hold that title, Shad Bogany. Would you stand up, please, Shad? Former candidate for Congress who is here and now helping others get elected to Congress, Javid Tayer. Would you stand up, Javid? Current chair of the Fort Bend County Democratic Party, Ms. Genya. Would you give her a hand, please? All right, I've announced enough people. I know you want to get down to serious business now. Brother, anybody ever tell you you look like Frederick Douglass? Look, the reincarnation of Frederick Douglass is in the house. Give him a hand, please. All right. Not quite, huh? All right. All right. All right. Thank you, dear brother. You're welcome. Listen, just a couple of things about these books. The first, I'm going to address the book that Ron wrote, Ron 5. And by the way, Ron, you were probably told, but he's a summa cum laude graduate. That's not bad. I am a thank you laude graduate. Maybe one or two others here. But his book, on the very first page of the foreword, the very first words are, impeachment is not a constitutional crisis. Impeachment is the cure for a constitutional crisis. And we should not assume that by doing what the Constitution requires, demands of us, that we are creating the crisis. No, we're responding, and we are going to have a solution to the crisis. Important point. Next point, and I'm coming to your question, sir. Next point from his book. He indicates that there are some people who believe that you should wait until the next election and act, rather than act now, when there's an impeachable act that's been performed. And here's what he says. Foolishly, these persons imagine that it is better to wait a lawless president out with faint hope of better results on some distant election day. They refuse to recognize that each failure to demand necessary accountability invites greater abuse and diminishes the prospect that accountability will ever be achieved. Good explanation for why you should wait. I have more to say on that at a later time. Now, let's look at Alan's book. Alan came into my office and visited with me early on in this process, and his visit really helped me get a great sense of direction. I want to read one passage from Alan's book. It reads, decisions on impeachment, decisions on whether to impeach a president
turn on the wisdom of Congress and do not require proof of a specific indictable crime under either federal or state law. No indictable crime under either federal or state law. The verdict of the House and the Senate is final. There is no right of appeal or judicial review of their decisions. That's a powerful statement, which is a good segue into your question, sir. You used the term crime, I believe, federal, union, some of that kind of language. There is no requirement that there be any crime committed. No crime committed at all. In the term high crimes and misdemeanors, the most important word is misdemeanor. Do you have your phones with you? Some of you use dictionary.com, right? Go to dictionary.com with me right now, if you would. And when you get to dictionary.com, would you kindly go to misdemeanor? I shall do so as well. Look up misdemeanor. I have to do this slowly. I peck rather than type. Somebody have misdemeanor? Anybody, if you get to it, raise your hand. This is kind of like church. Anybody got misdemeanor? Anybody? You have it? All right. Would you kindly identify yourself? Your dictionary.com?
Actually, I went on Google.
Okay, well, you're not using the same source. Did anybody go to dictionary.com? Okay, council member?
Hold on, I have it.
Okay.
Dictionary.com.
All right, would you read the second definition?
Okay, you don't want the noun, I'm assuming you want the second one.
Yes.
Okay, incident of misbehavior or misdeed.
Read it loud.
Incident of misbehavior, misdeed.
Okay, and she said incidents of misbehavior or misdeeds. Doesn't say crime. The first definition does deal with minor offense. But the second definition is what was important at the time. And if you'll notice, they give you the British spelling of misdemeanor right under that. And this is a word that we have borrowed from the language, the English language. And the founders, the framers, were at the time interested in finding out how they could extricate themselves from a person who was creating harm to society. And as a result of this, they had a great debate. But much of the debate was not about criminal acts, because they knew that a criminal could be prosecuted. They had some debate about where, perhaps whether it should be in the Senate or the House for removal purposes. But the Senate and the House don't deal with punishment. They are just removing the president from office. And to remove a president, you do not have to have a crime. Only have to have harm being committed such that it is creating harm to society. And if that is the case, then you can remove a president. Now, I'm going to say more in a minute. I just walked in on that, wanted to have a chance to intercede and say just a few words. But I'm going to now yield first to Alan on this question, and then to Ron on this very question. So, Alan, would you want to fill in the blanks on the question that was posed and the answer that I've given?
I think I already have, actually. I went through a pretty extensive disquisition on why impeachment need not be an indictable crime, why the statute books change all the time, but the criteria for impeachment remains the same. Misconduct by public men that seriously injures the society and that requires a combined moral, legal, and political judgment, which is why the framers did not put impeachment in the courts. They were very advisedly decided to put impeachment in a political body, and as Alexander Hamilton said, ultimately impeachments are denominated politically. And as John Adams said, every man is corruptible and every man needs to be checked. And the check on corruption of the most powerful person in the United States is the orderly, peaceful, and constitutional means of impeachment. It's a bit of a summary of what I've already said.
Thank you. Ron, if you would.
Yeah, and thank you, Representative Green, for putting this together. And the only thing I'll add on top of all of that is if you look at the actual history of congressional impeachments, there have only been a few impeachment processes against presidents, but there have been a lot against judges. And Congress the Congressional Research Service put out a study just a few years ago where they looked at it and they said less than a third of all of Congress's impeachments have even mentioned the word crime. or included a federal statute as part of it. So judges are impeached all the time. I shouldn't say all the time, it's not all the time. But judges have been impeached many times over our 2+ centuries of history.
About 15 times, yeah.
And there have been hearings against judges considering impeachment, even more than that, about 60 times, for offenses that are not criminal, that are serious misdeeds, serious misconduct, but doesn't necessarily violate a statute.
And Ron, would Judge Pickering be such a circumstance?
Yes, I talked about
Judge Pickering. Pickering was, I believe, the first.
The very first.
The
And
very
he was
first.
successfully
Yes.
impeached for misconduct that had nothing to do with criminal activity.
Nothing. All right, let me just now, and I'm going to come to you, Mr. Douglas. Let me explain something to you. Here's why there's confusion. There is a desire in this country to change the definition of what is an impeachable act. Various and sundry reasons exist. There are some who enjoy the status quo. Stock market's doing great. They're making lots of money. Why change a good thing? Why get involved with the removal of a president that's making money for them? Status quo politicians. I'm not one of them. There are some other people who genuinely, I believe, misunderstand what was happening at the time the framers of the Constitution were developing impeachment, and for whatever reasons they choose to stay with this misunderstanding. One such person has written a book. I see no need to call his name, but his book is not worth reading. If you already have it, try to get your money back. But the point is, the people who say, what law did he break? What rule did he break? They are perpetrating upon you a belief that is totally inaccurate. It is untrue. So this is why we're having this event today, so that we can deal with the untruthful statements, the falsehoods that have been perpetrated. I assure you, these scholars are correct because I've also checked what they've said, and there are other scholars who agree with them. In fact, most scholars in this country agree with us. Most. Okay, now, with that said, I'm going to go to Mr. Douglas, and then I'm going to take another. Was there another hand up before Mr. Douglas?
Mr. Douglas already had his
Yeah,
question.
okay. All right, Mr. Douglas, I'm going to come back to you. I think you and I are going to have a great conversation a bit, okay? All right, let me see. Who was next? Did we give out the numbers? We gave out numbers? We did not. Okay. All right, so everybody who wants to ask a question, raise your hands now, please. Everybody who wants to ask a question that hasn't, raise your hands, please. Okay, you will be 1, sir. You will be 2, sir. Anyone else? Raise your hands, please. Yeah, Mr. Douglas, I'm coming to you. Don't leave. Anybody else? All right, let's go to the person that I said was 1. Okay.
Yeah, no, that was the point of my question, which is that it's actually a crime. So you guys have to verify that the founding fathers actually set that up so that if it threatened the Union, whether that means it's divisive to stop us from civil war. So you actually answered my question. That's where I was going with that.
Well, it doesn't have to stop a civil war. That's the point.
When they did it under the
Yeah,
framework, what they were trying to do.
well, they weren't trying to stop a civil war when they wrote the Article 2, Section 4. Okay, but one other thing, let me just share this with you. I don't use the term founding fathers. You may if you choose. I say the framers of the Constitution, because the founders of this country picked a lot of cotton. Okay? That's just my language.
No, that's
Okay, all right.
I'll stop it.
All right, okay, all right. You will find that I'm pretty straightforward.
That's right,
Okay,
that's right.
all right. Alan, either of you like to add, Ron, anything before I go to the next question?
Well, let's go to the next
Okay, let's go to the next
We've already had
question.
a lot of great questions.
Okay, and then I'm going to insist that the former dean of the Thurgood Marshall School of Law say something. Okay, yes, sir, your question.
All right, so I'm Bill Cunningham, Creative Investment Research. So June 11, 2016, we predicted, our economic models predicted that Trump was going to win, and of course he did. Now, the question concerns, I should say that our models also predict that the Democrats will not win the House and the Senate come November because of the interference with respect to the mechanics of voting that you see. So given this, given a lack of taking over the House and the Senate, what are the steps that you would take? What's the probability of actual impeachment?
Okay, I'll deal with that. I'd like to wrap up with that question, if I may, please. But let me go to a person who is noted for his prognostications. This man just so happens to have been, I think, 100% right in about more than the last decade. Is that right, Alan?
Since 1984.
Since 1984, he has been predicting the winners of presidential elections, literally. And Alan, I'd like for you to chime in on the prognosticator's prognostication.
Yeah, I'm not sure what your models are. Maybe we could, you can email me something about it. But there is no model that is able to successfully predict midterm elections. There are just too many variables. And let's not forget, this midterm election, like so many elections, is tainted by political and racial gerrymandering. That is one of the greatest stains on our democracy, is the shameful way in which legislative districts, especially congressional districts, have been manipulated for partisan and racial advantage. And unfortunately, the courts have been very reluctant to step in and remedy this. Absent this political and racial gerrymandering, there is no doubt in my mind the Democrats would take over the House. But even given the political and racial gerrymandering, the history of midterm elections is a history of waves. And waves sweep a lot before it. And waves break late. And I do believe there is a wave breaking here. I do believe that the issue is Donald Trump. And I do believe that those who want to see Donald Trump checked and balanced, whether by impeachment or any other means, are those who have the enthusiasm and the motivation to turn out. Midterm elections defined by one word: turnout. Last time, only 38% of eligible Americans turned out. So if those who are unhappy with the status quo and unhappy with the president do turn out this time, there will be a wave, and there will be a Democratic takeover of the House.
Do you want to add anything, Ron?
No.
Before I come to you, Mr. Douglas, everybody's pointing to the door. They have noticed that my colleague has arrived and would have me give her an expression of appreciation. Sheila Jackson Lee, would you give her an expression of appreciation?
The gentleman has a gavel. I am only here because...
hold on just a moment. Since Keenan, would you take that microphone back?
I am giving it back. Thank you all very much.
No, I want you to come up here and speak. Okay, I didn't. Come on up, Congresswoman. Come on up. Come on up.
Representative Jackson must have heard the praise I lavished on her earlier.
Come on, no.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see both of you. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Okay, good. Thank you. Let me congratulate my colleague, Congressman Al Green, for his persistence on justice, and to my dear friends who have provided us with the astuteness of their intellect. Let us not be afraid of ending corruption. Let us not be afraid of right-sizing this government. Let us not be afraid of being able to use our constitutional privileges, which are in fact to have the kind of orderliness that Section 2 of the Constitution orders when it speaks about the executive. I conclude by saying that the first article in the Constitution is that of the legislature, of which my colleague and myself are members. The Founding Fathers must have had something in mind when they made this the first body, if you will, for us to do our job. And for us to be sure, because we are the people's representative, the closest of that in Washington, that we must make sure that we coddle the Constitution and that what happens here is done according to the Constitution, not for one person, but for the people and all of the people. So, Congressman Green, thank you so very much. I wanted to come by and thank you. And I know your work as we go forward. As a member of the Judiciary Committee, we are listening and listening very, very strongly. Thank you very much.
Give her another hand, please. Mr. Douglas. This Douglas this time. I'm sorry, he's a Douglas too. Would you bring the microphone over to Mr. Douglas, please? Yes. All right. He is the former president of Texas Southern University. This Douglas, right? I'd like to hear your comments if you have some that you'd like to share. A lawyer and the former dean of the law school.
Yeah, I was listening earlier when you said you couldn't impeach the president for being incompetent. But, you know, it's really crazy because whenever I go outside of the country, the first thing people say to me is, how do you deal with that crazy president? and so, even if he hadn't committed any crime, he's the representative of the people of the United States of America. And I do believe if any other foreign leader acted the way President Trump acted, we would be outraged and demand that they be removed. And so I'm just saying, what do you think of, maybe not incompetence, but a lack of leadership as an issue in terms of impeachment?
May I just add something to that to frame it a little bit for you? Add to it, and his incompetent behavior is harmful to society. Add that to it.
You've got to make that linkage.
Yeah.
And I think you can make that linkage. Absolutely. You know, I've been reading Bob Woodward's book. I read The Anonymous. And it's one thing to say, you know, the president is unhinged, the president, you know, is narcissistic, the president is incompetent. And that's all well and good, but as Representative Green says, you then have to link it to something. You can't leave it there. And I'm afraid too much of the public discussion leaves it there and doesn't tie it into the way that endangers our liberties, our freedoms, and our national security. Just as the president's lying, it's reprehensible unto itself, but it is also threatening to our society, and we have to draw those linkages.
Rob?
And thank you, Dean, for that question. I think what we see in Trump is an interesting combination of features that we've seen in different presidents, but not all combined in once. So, you know, Nixon had a lot of malicious intent, but he was actually very effective at accomplishing what he wanted to accomplish, whether for good or for bad. In both cases, he signed some very important legislation, but he also did some terrible things, in both cases effectively. We've had other presidents over the 200 plus years who were, you know, just not up to the task, but, you know, the country sort of got through it one way or the other because they weren't that intent on trying to tear the country apart, and we just sort of moved on without them. What Trump combines is a sort of incompetence, or maybe even a lack of full mental capacity. No one suggests that he has completely lost all of his marbles, and James Comey says that, you know, he's able to track conversations, and I believe that. But it's clear that there's something not operating at full strength there. And I say it with all respect to people who have or who have relatives who've suffered from mental illness. It's true that it's clear that he's not able to fully focus on the requirements of the job. When you combine that with his authoritarian, malicious, bigoted impulses, you get a unique combination that we have not seen, certainly for a long time, where the question is which is going to outweigh the other, the malevolence or the incompetence. And it's a question that I think may be interesting academically, but when you put them all together, it's a ground for removing him from office.
Let me give an additional addendum. As whole countries, talking about some countries in Africa, the Caribbean, South America, and then while discussing this and using that terminology, you produce a work product that is harmful to African countries. That's a link between his bigoted commentary and policy that's been produced. Policy rooted in bigotry. You decide that you are not going to be nice to suspects when you arrest them. And you tell the constabulary, the police, you don't have to be nice. You are announcing your position as a quasi-policy, pseudo-policy perhaps, but your position as it relates to persons who are in custody. And then children on the border of color. You produce a policy that separates them from their parents. Now this may be debatable, but for me, when I add all of this together, I find that I have a person who is placing his bigotry into policy that's harmful to our society. And for that, he ought to be impeached.
Let me add one thing to that, Congressman.
Yes,
this is so important. I just wrote another book. It came out this week.
Oh, I have it.
The Embattled Vote. Right? We are battling for our voting rights. Make no mistake about it. Our voting rights are not guaranteed. And look how bigotry has translated into the Department of Justice. It's turned its back on the Voting Rights Act and supporting voting rights in this country. Not only has it turned its back, it's done just the opposite. It has now defended and supported voter suppression in this country, and nothing is more precious than our vote, and that's a clear translation of what the Congressman is talking about.
And thank you. You're right about the voter suppression, and I promised that I was to myself that I was going to do something, Alan. I have your second book, and I just want to show people this book because this is pretty important. He's right about the voting. I'm right about the policy and the impeachment. We're both right.
Of course.
But here's the point I'd like to make about Alan's book, because I have to leave in just a moment. We have votes. His book is styled The Embattled Vote in America. I would commend it to you, and I would want you to, if you read nothing more, just read what is on the inside cover about the right to vote. Many of us believe that we have the right to vote. Alan makes the point in his book, the essence of it is this, that the Constitution doesn't say you have the right to vote. And the people who have produced the laws have not used the right in the production of the laws. They have literally made it a privilege for some people to vote and others to be excluded. Initially, white men, all landowners. And then they decided to bring some others in, some of it because of a war that was called to our attention. So this is a good read. I'm not saying that you should buy it, but I would say read it. I don't think that...
I say you should buy it.
Well, ethics won't allow me to say that, so I can't say it. But I think it's a good read. Now, finally, let me say this as I make my way before Amina has a mild cardiac arrest. I want to answer the question that many people pose, and I did not hear today, and that is, will we have articles of impeachment again? We have filed them twice. My hope is that that November will be a November to remember, and that we will see a change in the House of Representatives in terms of who has 250 votes. And if this occurs, my hope is that the Judiciary Committee will do what its function is, what it's designed to do, and that is take up at least an inquiry into what happened when the president is alleged to have told someone to commit a crime, and the person has acknowledged that the president directed him, that he did commit the crime. The person who said it was a lawyer, his lawyer was there in court with him, he pled guilty, it would seem, and the person happens to be the lawyer who represents the president. It seems to me that this is something worthy of the Judiciary Committee looking into. But let's assume that none of this happens for whatever reasons. I assure you that we will have articles of impeachment voted on again in the House of Representatives. And the reason we will do it is because we ought not let bigotry go unchecked. We can't let bigotry be just a talking point. At some point, it has to become an action item. Bigotry in this country is the #1 problem facing a good many of Americans, many of whom are of African ancestry. And if we think that just by passing a law that raises the minimum wage, that solves discrimination in hiring, it doesn't. So you got to have a bigotry agenda. You cannot assume that passing a law that says that we ought not allow women to be discriminated against is going to be the end of it, because women still make less than men, something like 24 cents on a dollar, depending on who's counting and how you count, less than men. So we've got to take on bigotry with an agenda. A part of my bigotry agenda, my agenda opposed to bigotry, my anti-bigotry agenda is this: to make sure that everybody goes on record, because history is going to judge us all. This is a moment in time when the world is watching, and we ought not let bigotry of this magnitude go unchecked. I will bring articles of impeachment once we have a new Congress. If no one else does, I will do it, because I owe it to unborn generations to do what I can to take on this challenge. And those who say, well, why don't you wait? Here's my response to you. Those who say, why don't you wait? Dr. King didn't wait. Dr. King, knowing that what had happened on Bloody Sunday, still went back to the Edmund Pettus Bridge and crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He didn't think that crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge was going to end all of the ills in our society, eliminate invidious discrimination. Rosa Parks took that seat on the bus. She didn't think that she was going to end invidious discrimination that night. We all have a watch, and we all have to do what we can to move the agenda forward. This is my watch. This is my agenda. I am going to move it forward. We will have another vote on impeachment. Thank you very much, everybody. I told this gentleman out here, all you got to do is you got to say your part in 30 seconds so that I can give you a response.
30 seconds?
30 seconds.
Okay, you mentioned consent, you mentioned harm to society.
Yes.
Who determines whether harm has been done to society?
I'll tell you.
We the people, put the man in office because you all killed that man.
Now, Dr. Douglas, let me answer you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'll tell you who determines it. We, the people who have elected representatives to serve in Congress, to represent you. And we use our best judgment to determine what our constituents want. So if we decide, listen, if we decide and you don't like what we do, then you take us out of office. But that's what you do. That's what you do. You do that. You do that. But until that is done, we, the people who have elected representatives, will make the decision. Give our scholars a big hand, please. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. See you next time.